In a recent phone call between the leaders of China and the US, President Xi told President Trump that Taiwan's return to China is a key part of Beijing's global vision. Xi said it's an integral part of China's post-war international order. In China's eyes, Taiwan's future is inevitable. And if you look at the activities of several of China's Indo-Pacific neighbours, they appear to be preparing for some sort of escalation. For example, the Philippines has recently signed a defence pact with Canada to boost its standing and its defences in the South China Sea. So, Victor, I'm going to go straight to you first. Is China preparing to take Taiwan by force?
Taiwan is part of China. There is only one China, as declared by the Declaration of Cairo, as well as dictated by the Potsdam Proclamation. These two documents form the pillars upon which the international order was based upon after the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe and the Japanese fascism in the Asian Pacific region. So the whole world recognizes this policy. And there is no country in the world which can recognize both China and Taiwan at the same time. And we need to be fully aware of this. By defending this one China policy, we are defending the international order established back in 1945.
Ross, you're in Taiwan. How do you interpret what Victor has said? Victor, I'm going to bring you in a moment, Bill, but I just want to get a quick response to you from that, Victor, particularly on that. Unification is either peacefully or by force, because even though you say that it is one China, a lot of countries, particularly the US, do not support a unilateral change to the status quo, which is, as Ross said, they are governed separately. So any change to that status quo, is it going to be peaceful or is it going to be by force?
First of all, we all know there was a civil war towards the end of the 1940s. Allow me to emphasize that civil war was never brought to an official end by any means. That is the reality of the separation across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Now, if China ever uses force, it will not be an invasion. It will be a resurrection of the unfinished civil war. And we want to avoid that. We want to achieve unification by peaceful means. But if, for example, as Ross said, other countries want to be stakeholders, to be intervening in this situation, there will be the resurrection of the unfinished civil war. And I don't think any country in the world, including the United States, wants to shed the blood of their soldiers to be involved in a resurrected civil war across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Let's all work together to achieve the peaceful reunification that all of us want, and let's do our best to avoid the resurrection of the unfinished civil war.
Bill, Victor, what do you make of that? I mean, jump in, please, if you feel you want to respond to this idea of can you imagine a nuclear-armed Japan and South Korea in response to China's actions in Taiwan? That's a big risk for China to take, is it not?
Allow me to mention, I'm shocked to hear some of the remarks from the other co-panelists. They talk about Japan as if Japan is in the same line with China. No. If you read the United Nations Charter, there is a particular clause called enemy state, and Japan is an enemy state as far as that clause is concerned. Meaning the Japanese government are prohibited from possessing combative weapons of aggression to constitute another threat to the victor nations, including China. And if, for example, Japan wants to rearm and to constitute another threat to the victor nations, including China, the United Nations Charter authorizes the victor nations to take unilateral military actions against Japan without the need to consult and inform the United Nations Security Council beforehand. That means if you look at China and Japan, they are not equal. One is the country which unconditionally surrendered in 1945. The other country, China is a victor nation, together with other allied countries like the United States. So never talk to me about Japan developing nuclear weapons. If they do that, that will be the moment of their annihilation, because they will constitute threat to China, and China has all the power and the authorization to destroy that new menace from Japan. China will never allow Japan to become another militaristic or fascist country because of the prohibition of the United Nations Charter. And that is part of the condition upon which Japan unconditionally surrendered. And no one should even think about Japan raising its head of fascism again to threaten China.
Bill, do you want to
Well, I
jump
think
in?
that's a really good reason for why the status quo should be preserved. I mean, if you don't want to unravel the post-war security order in East Asia, then preserve the current status of Taiwan and carry on with business as usual. I think that Victor has made a very strong case there for preventing a whole series of unforeseen consequences from China attempting to change the status quo over Taiwan.
Allow me to add a point. I think to preserve the legacy of the Second World War is to make sure China is a united country. And no one should indulge in the fantasy that China should ever be separated across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Meaning, to achieve national unity for China is a precondition of preserving the victory legacy of the Second World War. If you argue with me otherwise, you either don't read history or you are misguided by your misperception of the realities of the world. If any one country wants to fight militarily against China to prevent China's reunification, he or she will be doomed to failure. If you ever want to try that, then you are really playing peril for yourself.
Can I ask a question?
As far as the United Nations enemy state clause, many experts do consider that obsolete, and even China voted for a resolution affirming that it was obsolete, and that vote was in the 1990s. So whether or not it still applies is actually it's kind of an unresolved legal question at the moment. But I do think that the likelihood of Japan developing nuclear weapons in the near term is highly unlikely. However, the reality is that Japan is significantly increasing its defense budget. They've been doing so ever since Abe came back as prime minister in 2012, and that's continued under Abe's successors since 2020. They've changed their prime minister multiple times, but it's clear that the trajectory is for increased spending, not just by Japan, but again, as I said, by other countries in the region. So we are in an arms race here in Asia.
Bill, you wanted to ask a question of Victor?
Oh yeah, please allow me to mention something obsolete without being terminated still is not terminated. Therefore, allow me to emphasize for your benefit, as well as the benefit of our audience, that the United Nations Charter Enemy Clause remains on the book, and it can be triggered if Japan wants to move in the wrong direction of rearmament and remilitarization to such an extent that it constitutes a threat to China. China will go to war with Japan if Japan wants to rearm itself, as well as even possessing the nuclear weapon, because that is the right authorized by the victor nations as reflected in the enemy clause in the United Nations Charter. Don't be misguided about the so-called obsolete of that clause. That clause remains on the book. I've checked with the Security Council office just recently, and they reaffirmed the validity of that enemy clause. So don't play with fire. If you advise Japan, ask them to read very carefully.
Bill, you wanted to ask a question. Go ahead. But I also want to ask you, Bill, does Victor have a point here?
Well, it does. I mean, we're all kind of getting a bit hypothetical here. I mean, my question, my comments about, the next stage all followed from, a forcible change of the status quo over Taiwan. And so in saying that if the status quo does change, then I think, it will trigger a whole load of other moves, by the regional powers, by Japan, by South Korea, and, presumably, wider than that as well. But I do think there's an interesting question here. I mean, given that it's, so long since, China, the mainland, actually ruled Taiwan, I just wonder, asking Victor, hypothetically, do you think that the Irish are a different group of people, a different nation to the British, Victor?
You are completely wrong. The better comparison is the United Nations versus the Confederation. There was only one country, that is the United States of America. The Confederation wants to break away from the Union. And if you test the opinion at that time, probably up to 100% of the people in the Confederation wanted to break away from the Union. Why President Lincoln was ranked as one of the greatest presidents of the United States? He refused to accept that. He wants to use force to bring back the Confederation into the Union. Therefore, as you can see, President Lincoln and the Federation won. The Confederation was defeated. They were brought back into the Union by force, by defeating the Confederation. This is a better comparison for the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. China will never allow breakaway of Taiwan because if you read the Potsdam Proclamation and the Cairo Declaration, Taiwan in its entirety should be returned to China upon the unconditional surrender of Japan. And it was returned. Now, there was a civil war afterwards, but there was only one China. China being separated across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, that is a fact. But there is only one China. And if Taiwan wants to break away from China, China will need to bring them back into China by force, as President Lincoln did vis-a-vis the Confederation. That is not aggression. That is not using force against another country. That is civil war, as the civil war in the United States. Thereafter, the United States has always been one country under God, indivisible. China should always be indivisible after the reunification of Taiwan.
Yeah, but I think if we went back 120 years when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and we can see that things change. And if people decide that they are a nation and that they deserve self-determination, well, why shouldn't they have self-determination?
Allow me to emphasize, what the British or the English or the Irish want to do, it's their business. What the Chinese want to do here on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, it is our business. As I declared just now, there is only one China. If you go back to Ireland and ask your government whether they recognize two China or one China, one Taiwan, you will be informed that they recognize only one China. They recognize that Taiwan is part of China, and China has full authorization as a sovereign country to deal with a part of its territory which wants to break away. And the better principle you need to keep in your mind is what President Lincoln did with the Confederation. Whatever Lincoln did to the Confederation, China has the right to do the same for the so-called breakaway Taiwan province.
That brings me to something I want to bring you in here on, Ross, because Victor says, what happened. What do you think about those weapons being available, Victor? Does that pose an issue for China?
Allow me to make one perspective. We talk about U.S.-Taiwan relations as if, they started from yesterday. No. When Dr. Henry Kissinger made the secret visit to China in 1971, when President Nixon made the state visit to China in 1972, the United States had diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in Taiwan. And the United States and Taiwan, or the Republic of China, had a defense treaty. And the United States stationed tens of thousands of military troops in Taiwan. In order to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China, the United States broke off all these points. they decided to withdraw all the US troops stationed in Taiwan back out of Taiwan. They broke off diplomatic recognition with Taiwan. They even rescinded the US ROC Defense Treaty, which was a domestic law in the United States. They did all the impossibilities in order to do what? To normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. Now, yes, of course, the United States is still supplying weapons to Taiwan, but do you know where will be these weapons after the reunification? Most of these weapons, if not destroyed, will be on display in a military museum, either somewhere in Taiwan or in mainland China. Therefore, if you think that the weapons supplied to Taiwan by the United States will enable the separatists in Taiwan to defeat China, you are indulging in fantasy. The United States publicly acknowledges, in terms of a conventional weapon, the Chinese conventional weapons are not inferior to the United States. They are actually, in many cases, already superior to the US weapons. In terms of other weapons, China's weapons are ahead of the United States. For example, President Trump is talking about F-47, for example, the sixth generation of the Phantom stealth planes. China is already producing two types of that from two manufacturers, one in Chengdu, the other one in Shenyang. And if the United States does not have the supply of rare earth from China, their defense industry will grind down to a halt. So don't think, if you think about the war between China and the United States will win the war. What if they don't? What if they lose the war? Especially in a war close to the Chinese coastline, and every inch of land in Taiwan is fully covered by the long-range artillery pieces in Fujian, in Guangdong, and in Zhejiang. So you are talking about a completely one-sided war if the war ever breaks out. Let's all use our sanity to propose peace rather than agitating for war. The war will be quick. It will be very, very swift, and the result will not be surprising at all. And if you are betting on the wrong side of the equation, what if you are on the wrong side? What if you are on the losing side? That is the moment of truth. We all need to think about it. And China will never take any military action unless it is fully believed, fully convinced it is on the right side of history.
Okay.
What will make China to reach that conviction? To achieve national unity is always the right thing for China to do. And to defend and preserve the victory legacy of the Second World War after defeating Japanese fascism is always the right thing to do. If you are a British or an Australian, don't forget all the atrocities and the crimes against humanity, against your nationals, and humanity as a whole committed by the Japanese fascism in the Second World War.
We're going to come back to Japan in just a moment, but I want to bring our other two guests back in. Ross, it doesn't... President Joe Biden explicitly pledged several times during his term in office to come to Taiwan's defence if war erupted. Do you think that